April 17, 1945. Outside the shattered town of Bad Langensalza, central Germany, the war was ending in waves of flame and surrender. The Western Front had collapsed, Wehrmacht units were disintegrating, and what remained of the 11th Panzer Army was dissolving into pockets of hungry men walking with their hands up. A truck carrying 6 German Red Cross nurses jolted over a shell-pitted road. The women were pale, silent, exhausted. Their uniforms were caked with dried blood, some of it their own, most of it not. In the back, Sister Else Schneider gripped the wooden slats with both hands as the vehicle bounced again. She hadn't slept in 3 days. Their driver was dead, shot through the neck 2 towns back, and now they were under the guard of 2 American MPs in steel helmets and pressed wool uniforms, who said nothing as the truck turned onto a narrow gravel path toward what they'd called a regimental aid station. Sister Schneider expected chaos, makeshift tents, blood pooling in the dirt, screaming, the kind of field hospital they had built from scratch in Poland and France, and most recently in the ruins of Kassel, where the wounded sometimes outnumbered supplies 5 to 1. Instead, she heard something else. It was faint at first, a strange hissing rhythmic like paper tearing, then a fluttering crackle soft but constant like wind against a wall of plastic sheets, and then came the scent, strong, sharp, too clean to be real. She turned to the others. "Do you smell that?" No one answered. The truck slowed. The aid station wasn't a tent, it was a warehouse, and it wasn't chaos inside. It was quiet. Rows of clean cots stood in symmetry. The floor had been mopped. A nurse in a crisp olive uniform moved calmly between patients, and there, on long folding tables, were stacks of things that seemed impossible. Morphine, bandages, gauze, clean gloves, rubber tourniquets, labeled jars of antiseptic, blood plasma in cold storage, syringes individually wrapped, stacks of sterile pads enough to cover a battalion's worth of wounds. Sister Schneider stopped walking. One of the Americans gestured forward. "You'll be processed here, help with triage, nurse stations through there." She didn't move. Her eyes were locked on a metal tray where a corpsman, clean-shaven, steady hands, inserted a new needle into a sealed morphine ampule and tapped the air bubbles free before injecting it into a soldier's arm. Morphine injected with clinical precision. No hesitation, no measuring droplets, no diluted vial shared between 3 screaming men, just 1 soldier, 1 dose. She whispered unmerglich. The supply tray had 8 more full syringes. 2 days earlier, they had operated on a major with no anesthesia. He'd bitten through a leather strap and died of shock during the amputation. They had no morphine left. They'd run out of gauze weeks ago and had been reusing old bandages soaked in vinegar. Now before her were rows of fresh white packs wrapped and sealed. American nurses moved briskly, their sleeves rolled up, their carts stocked. It wasn't just shocking, it was humiliating. Sister Hildegard murmured beside her, "This must be for the generals." But they were treating privates, farm boys with shattered legs and shell-shocked eyes. It didn't matter. Everyone got the same sterile gloves. Everyone got real morphine. Everyone got care. They were not treating class. They were treating bodies. A loudspeaker crackled overhead announcing an incoming convoy. The MPs pointed again. "Inside, you're not prisoners. You're being reassigned. You speak English. That makes you valuable. Let's go." They passed another corridor. Boxes were being unloaded from a truck. Not wooden crates but wax-sealed cartons with typed labels. Supplies. Real medical supplies. Schneider slowed her steps. One box, partially opened, revealed its contents. Dozens of sealed glass ampoules of penicillin. She stopped completely. Penicillin, not powdered sulfa, not guesswork and prayer. It had taken German hospitals 2 years to make enough penicillin to treat 10 men. This box could treat hundreds. The realization began to bloom in her chest like panic. These were not stockpiles brought from Washington. These were expendables. The Americans were unloading them casually, restocking. This wasn't the front line. This was routine. And then she understood. This was not a miracle. This was normal for them. The enemy she had been taught to despise, loud, undisciplined, greedy, had arrived with a level of organized mercy she had never seen. There was no screaming, no scarcity, no hierarchy. A bloodied soldier on a stretcher was rolled past her. The nurse beside him, an American with blonde hair tied in a neat bun, looked at Schneider and smiled, warm and effortless. "Welcome to the ward. You'll be helping with compression wraps and dressings once we process your paperwork." Schneider blinked. We are not under arrest." "No, ma'am, you're nurses. You help people, we don't waste that." Later, Schneider would stand at a folding table, carefully wrapping gauze around a wounded man's thigh, watching as a corpsman unwrapped a fresh packet of surgical tape and simply tossed the empty wrapper into a bin. She stared at it, that small plastic scrap. In Germany, you never threw anything away. Another nurse reached across her to grab a fresh tourniquet, not realizing Schneider had stopped. She looked up. "You okay?" Schneider nodded slowly. "Yes, I'm just not used to this." The nurse smiled. "You will be." That night, lying on a cot that didn't reek of old blood, in a room that had electric lights and warm water, Sister Else Schneider listened to the silence. Not a single scream. She closed her eyes and wept. She had been in American custody for 4 days when she realized they were going to let her sleep. Not just rest, not just collapse into unconsciousness from exhaustion, but sleep, uninterrupted, without shouting or sudden orders or the metallic taste of blood in the air. Sister Else Schneider woke not to boots stomping or shelling in the distance, but to the smell of coffee, real coffee, not roasted barley, not ersatz powder stirred into cold water. Someone was brewing it in a large steel urn in the corner of the medical station. It had a thin, sharp smell, slightly burnt, but it made her chest ache with a hunger she didn't realize she still had. Sister Hildegard sat across the tent at a folding table, already dressed, her hair braided with regulation precision. She was wrapping gauze around a soldier's arm while speaking to one of the American nurses. The conversation was quiet, professional, almost warm. Else pulled herself upright and swung her legs off the cot. She still wore her Red Cross uniform. No one had taken it from her. No one had interrogated her. The Americans hadn't even searched her personal effects, just asked if she could speak English and sent her to assist with the evening triage. She had expected confinement, rations, suspicion. What she had found instead was worse, in a quiet and unspeakable way. They had no fear of running out. The morphine was restocked every morning. The gauze came in crates with dates less than a month old. Bandages were discarded if stained too heavily. No one boiled wrappings. No one cut them into strips. Used ones went into metal bins and disappeared. And it wasn't just for American soldiers. That was the part that made her throat tighten. There were wounded German soldiers in the far tent. Prisoners, surely, she saw the armbands, but they were receiving the same care. The same morphine, the same antiseptics. Their bandages were just as white, their wounds just as cleaned. A boy with a mangled thigh who had once worn the Feldgendarmerie gorget was now sleeping peacefully with a pulse monitor clipped to his finger and a folded blanket tucked under his feet. The Americans treated even the men who had ordered them shot. Else sat at the edge of her cot, her bare feet on the cold concrete floor, and tried to summon some sense of hatred, some pride, some belief that they were decadent or soft or simply trying to humiliate her. But no humiliation had ever looked this organized. A nurse walked by, American, dark-haired, maybe 30, carrying a tray of syringes and forceps. She smiled at Else. You slept long, she said in German, flawless. Else blinked, you speak our language. Majored in it before the war. She moved past, still smiling. Breakfast is in the back if you're hungry. Else stood. Her stomach ached. She hadn't eaten more than crusts in days, but as she walked toward the rear table, she stopped again. On a low shelf beside the stove, rows of white-labeled boxes gleamed under the lantern light. Bandage rolls, antibiotics, surgical soap, bottles of saline, tin containers of powder-free gloves, all medium-sized. There were no locks on them. They weren't hidden or rationed or signed out. They weren't under a senior officer's control. They were just there. It was as if the idea of scarcity didn't exist for them. Hildegard appeared beside her, a ceramic mug of coffee in her hand. It's real, she said softly, following Else's gaze. Everything here is real. Else didn't respond. I was in Stettin when the American bombing started, Hildegard continued, staring into the steam. We had 2 stretchers for 43 patients. You remember, we used curtain rods for splints, salt water for cleaning wounds, sometimes vodka. Else nodded slowly. I remember. They're not doing this to shame us, Hildegard whispered. This isn't for show. Else closed her eyes. She could feel her throat closing. They've always had this. Later that afternoon, they were called to assist with a new batch of incoming prisoners. A transport truck rolled up with half a dozen wounded Wehrmacht soldiers, shrapnel, burns, amputations. The kind of injuries that usually meant dying in a field ditch with 1 morphine ampule divided between 3 men and a prayer for a priest to arrive in time. Now American corpsmen lifted them gently onto cots, cut away burned cloth with sterilized shears, and began treatment without even asking for orders. The wounds were catalogued, stabilized, bandaged. Nurses moved with calm efficiency. Else was assigned to assist in dressing abdominal lacerations. She worked side by side with a black American nurse, tall, confident, quiet. The woman passed her fresh gauze, then reached for a new sealed pack before Else could even request one. The wounded man on the cot grunted in pain. He was barely 18. Else glanced down at him. His eyes fluttered. His uniform was burned. She reached for the morphine, hesitating. The American nurse caught her look. Use it. Don't wait for permission. Else fumbled slightly, then injected the dose. The boy's breathing slowed. His fingers stopped clawing at the sheets. Thank you, Else murmured. The American nurse only said, we don't run out. Else swallowed. Do you mean this morphine, the gauze, everything? There is more. There's always more, the nurse said. This station gets resupplied every 48 hours. Trucks come in from a depot outside Frankfurt. They stock all 5 aid stations, plus 3 full field hospitals. How? Else whispered. The nurse paused. Her tone was not cruel but honest. You're not just losing the war because of tanks or planes, she said. You're losing it because we never run out of anything. That night, Else couldn't sleep. She sat by the edge of the ward, watching the lantern light flicker on crates labeled medical field priority. She remembered the last aid post she'd run near Torgau. 4 soldiers died of blood loss because they had no clamps. Another suffocated on his own blood while she tried to suction it with a rubber bulb that had cracked in the cold. And now, 2 weeks later, she was standing in a place where wounded men were wrapped, medicated, comforted, and then fed. Else watched an American nurse kneel beside a soldier missing most of his foot. She adjusted his pillow. Then she sang softly while dressing the wound. It wasn't just abundance, it was dignity. Else covered her face with both hands and tried not to make a sound. The war was ending, but the shock was. She had never imagined that defeat could come not only from force, but from care. 3 weeks passed. The Americans still hadn't asked her to sign anything. Else waited. At first, She expected interrogation, not the cruel Gestapo kind, but formal paperwork at the very least. Instead, the closest thing to an interview had been a clipboard handed to her by an American lieutenant with warm eyes who simply asked if she preferred to work in trauma, recovery, or logistics. She had chosen trauma instinctively, though her hands still trembled sometimes. The others were assigned elsewhere, Sister Hildegard to the recovery wing, Anna and Greta to the pharmacy stockroom. They were not guarded. They were not restrained. They moved between tents and stations as freely as the American personnel. A few of the younger nurses, American and German, even began to swap quiet jokes between bandage changes. One day, someone laughed. It shocked Else more than the first morphine crate. The hospital never ran dry. Every second day, trucks rolled up the gravel road and backed into the supply bay. Men in clean uniforms unloaded crates stamped in large black letters. U.S. Army Medical Department. They carried cases of morphine, saline, antibiotics, surgical soap, splints, stretchers, canvas water tanks, blood plasma, tourniquets. And it wasn't for generals, it was for everyone. There were no lectures about saving supplies. No shrill matrons shouting that the iodine was down to its last drop. No bottles hoarded in locked trunks. If a bandage soaked through, it was removed and replaced without hesitation. If a wound worsened, a second dose of penicillin was administered without a second thought. At first, the German nurses hesitated, old habits whispered in their ears. But the Americans expected them to act, not to ration. There were systems, yes, clipboards, checklists, routines, but there was never a shadow of fear behind them. Else once fumbled with an empty saline bag, unsure whether to use another. An American nurse looked at her with mild confusion and asked, "Why wouldn't you?" Else had no answer. By May, the weather warmed. The trees outside the aid station bloomed, unnatural, beautiful, indifferent. So too did the routines. The nights no longer echoed with pain. Groans were muffled by morphine. Wounds were closed with catgut and sealed with dressings made sterile by steam. The patients no longer thrashed in agony. They slept. They recovered. One day, Hildegard stared at the morning rounds chart for nearly a full minute before she said it aloud. "We haven't had an amputation in 12 days. Else looked up. "I remember going 12 hours without morphine and losing 3 limbs to gangrene. Now, we haven't lost a single leg in 12 days. They both stared at the chart in silence. Later that afternoon, Else helped set a compound fracture in a boy no older than 19. His femur had shattered under tank shrapnel. Under German care, he would have died. Here, he had been airlifted from a frontline station, stabilized, prepped, and now lay unconscious under ether while 2 surgeons worked quickly, confidently, guided by an X-ray plate and adequate lighting. No panic, no yelling, no guessing. Else monitored the pressure drip. The American doctor glanced at her and nodded, as if they had worked together for years. "Good hand," he said simply. She nodded back. That evening, when she stepped outside for a breath of fresh air, she saw a line of American soldiers forming at the mess tent. She almost didn't notice the 2 German POWs in the line. Then she looked again. They were being served the same food. The same potatoes, the same beans, a smaller portion maybe, but the same bread, the same bowl, the same spoon. No officer berated them. No one shouted. The MP at the end of the line handed the nearest German a canteen of water. Else leaned against the frame of the tent and stared. She thought of the German camps she had passed through 2 years ago, Soviet prisoners half-starved, the wounded denied morphine to conserve stock. She had known. She had seen it. Now she saw the inverse. American prisoners were fed, treated, bandaged, spoken to like people. She didn't feel shame yet. That would come later. For now, there was only confusion. A dizzying recognition that the enemy had not just overwhelmed them with tanks and guns, but with systems, with order, with mercy. That last one was the hardest to accept. One night, during a rare quiet stretch between convoys, Sister Greta asked the question they had all been thinking. "Do you think they're doing this for propaganda?" They were sitting outside, the four of them, their uniforms cleaned, boots drying by the fence. "Do you think it's a show," Greta pressed, "for us to go back and tell others, to make us believe it?" Els considered this. "If it is," she said at last, "then it is the most expensive theater I've ever seen." The others laughed, bitter, tired, genuine. Hildegard added, "No theater stocks this much morphine." 2 days later, Els was transferred to an American field hospital 30 kilometers east. It was larger, closer to a real facility than a battlefield aid station. The Red Cross issued her new documentation. She was officially assigned as a volunteer nurse under American supervision. Still not a prisoner, not quite free either, something in between. Her first day at the new station, she walked into the supply room to retrieve a suture kit. The clerk, a corporal with a Midwestern accent and a crooked smile, pointed to the wall. "Help yourself. Top shelves 30, middles 40. Sterile packs on the left." Els blinked. "You don't track them, sign out." He shrugged. "We count every third day. If we're short, we get more." She stared at him. "And if someone takes too much?" He grinned. "Then they're probably a nurse doing their job." Els took the pack and walked out, her head spinning. She thought of the nurses she had known in the Reich, brilliant, hard women, who could save lives with nothing but vinegar and gauze scraps, who had been imprisoned for misuse of antibiotics, or for letting Russian children into the clinics. Here, a nurse could take what she needed. No one questioned her judgment. The tools were assumed to exist for the patient's sake. After her shift, she found a quiet corner and opened her notebook. She stared at the first blank page. She wrote one line. "It is not the supplies that shock me. It is the ease with which they trust us to use them." Later that night, the lights flickered as a generator hiccuped. A passing medic tapped it twice and it returned to life. Elle sat in her cot, holding a small sealed packet of gauze in her hands. She would never forget the way the paper felt, crisp, dry, perfect, not yellowed, not torn, not stitched from strips of old shirts. She turned it over. The expiration date was 3 months away. That meant they'd throw it out if unused. She thought of the boy in Dresden who had bled out while she begged an officer for a single fresh roll. He was 16. Here, this one packet was a rounding error. She set it aside, not to hoard, not to waste. Just to remember. The war officially ended on May 8th. Els had been changing a dressing on a burned patient's shoulder when the news came through. There was no radio announcement, no trumpet fanfare, just a bulletin clipped to the wall of the ward that read, "RE, Germany. Unconditional surrender effective 1 HOURS, May 8, 1945. Some of the American staff cheered. One nurse wept in silence behind the curtain. A few of the German prisoners in the recovery wing stared out at the gravel road for hours, saying nothing at all. Els didn't cry. Not then, not in front of anyone. She simply changed the dressing, disposed of the old gauze, washed her hands, and stepped out into the corridor to breathe. The air smelled of carbolic acid and wet linen. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The following morning, the head nurse, a woman named Sergeant Walker, called Els aside and handed her a folded uniform blouse. It was American issue, starched and pressed, Red Cross insignia, plain white armband. "You'll need this," Walker said. "You're being transferred again." Els blinked. "Am I being sent home?" Walker hesitated. "Not quite. The Army's setting up humanitarian stations across Bavaria, processing centers for civilians, displaced persons, wounded Axis personnel. You speak English, you've worked trauma, and you haven't tried to run once. That makes you gold. Else unfolded the blouse. It was clean. It was new. It smelled like soap. She didn't know whether to thank her or apologize. Her new station was outside Regensburg. It had once been a schoolhouse, then a Wehrmacht command post, now converted into a processing center for German civilians and wounded soldiers being filtered out of shattered units. There were no more salutes, no more flags. The Reich was gone. What remained were limping men, starved women, orphaned children. People clutched paper tags with numbers and no destinations. And there in the center of it all was a supply tent. Crates again, bandages again, morphine, gauze, bottles of quinine, cartons of powdered milk, a row of wooden tables where nurses, German and American, stood shoulder to shoulder dressing wounds, washing infections, filling syringes. Else picked up the routine as if she had never left. Her hands remembered everything, but her thoughts kept drifting to what she no longer expected to see: improvisation, struggle, desperation. They still arrived broken, but they did not leave that way. By the second week, Else had treated over 100 patients, former soldiers mostly, many of them terrified. Some flinched when approached. Others asked in low voices if this was a real hospital or an American trick. One day, a nurse from Missouri placed a warm hand on Else's arm after treating a malnourished teenager. "You know what surprises me most," she said, "how shocked they are when we don't hit them." Else didn't answer, but she understood. Later that month, Else was assigned to a group escorting wounded evacuees to a U.S. Army General Hospital near Munich. It was her first time seeing one in full operation. The moment she stepped through the front gate, she froze. It was a city. Dozens of buildings, ambulance bays, operating theaters, rows of sterile storage rooms, a full power grid, industrial-grade laundry, a blood bank. She passed a laboratory where 3 technicians were testing blood cultures. In the main wing, a nurse was consulting X-rays on a backlit wall board while a pharmacist filled bottles of penicillin by the dozen. Elle stopped in the corridor. She wasn't breathing. A doctor noticed. He smiled gently, first time. She nodded. "It's something, isn't it?" She whispered, "I thought we had hospitals." He said nothing, just gave her a look she wouldn't forget. Later that day, she watched a medical orderly toss a half-used roll of surgical tape into the disposal bin. The man saw her glance and shrugged. It was sticking weird. "We've got boxes more." Boxes more. Always boxes more. She thought of the trench clinics on the Eastern Front, how they'd used twine to hold gauze in place, how entire surgeries had been delayed because they lacked one clamp or sterile drape. She thought of a baby that died in Lviv from septic infection because they'd run out of sulfa. Of an SS officer who took the last morphine ampule during the Warsaw Uprising, leaving 2 civilians to die in agony. And here tape was tossed because it stuck weird. The camp outside Augsburg was not a hospital. It was a wound with tents. Over 12,000 civilians, Polish, Hungarian, German, Ukrainian, were packed into it, many still wearing the remnants of uniforms or prison clothing. Children ran barefoot. Women boiled potatoes over open fires. The trauma was everywhere, stitched into every expression. But there were supplies. The Red Cross had erected a supply center, and Else now wore the armband officially. She'd never imagined that a white cross on a red field could come to mean salvation. In the Reich, it had always meant hierarchy, status, control. Now it meant clean water, it meant saline drips, it meant real gauze. The distribution table was restocked every day. Morphine again, soap, tin boxes of gloves, tetanus ampoules, diapers, bandages that smelled faintly of alcohol and not of rot. The American trucks came 3 times a week. Else learned their schedules by heart. She stood in the cold dawn air counting cartons, verifying manifests, stacking linen-wrapped surgical kits beside a Polish medic named Thomas, who still walked with a limp from a Russian shell fragment. No one shouted anymore. No one stole. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes they ran low. Sometimes things disappeared. But nothing resembled the months she had spent watching men die over the lack of a single clamp. She worked 12-hour days, slept on a cot, ate hot rations from mess tins, and slowly the disbelief that had gripped her since Bad Langensalza began to dissolve. Not because she stopped being shocked, but because she began to expect it. One evening, a German woman collapsed outside the infirmary, shaking with fever. She was a former nurse, Else learned, discharged after her hospital was bombed. Her lungs rattled with infection. Her body was thin and burned. Else knew by instinct what the old Germany would have done: isolate her, wait to see if she recovered, if not, make her comfortable. But in this camp they brought her inside, hooked her to oxygen, administered penicillin. 4 vials, no hesitation. Else watched them enter the lot numbers into the ledger without blinking. 3 days later, the woman opened her eyes. When she did, her first words were, "How did you have enough?" Else knelt beside her and said, "Because they never ran out." The camp's recovery tents began to fill not with moans but with breathing, with sleep. One morning, Else walked through the rows and realized no one was screaming. The noise of dying had been replaced by the quiet of healing. It struck her again during a wound inspection on a Czech teenager with a crushed ankle. The boy was terrified. His father had been executed by the SS. He hadn't spoken a word since arriving. Else sat beside him, unwrapped the old dressing, examined the stitches, and reached for a sealed pouch. She opened it. Inside, sterile gauze, folded, clean, white. She pressed it gently to his skin. He flinched, then looked down. "You can keep this one," she said in German, soft as breath. "There's more." The boy blinked. He took the gauze in his fingers like a relic. Else didn't cry until that night. She sat on the ground behind the pharmacy tent, fingers digging into the cold dirt, and let it come. Because this, more than anything, proved the Reich had failed. Not because its soldiers had been beaten, not because Berlin had fallen, but because in the end, the thing they had believed themselves superior in, organization, logistics, control, had been obliterated by a convoy of trucks full of morphine and gauze that never stopped arriving. She remembered walking through hospitals where even the sterile cloth had been reused until it was gray, where wounded men begged for quinine and were told to die quietly, where surgeries were performed with no anesthesia because the last dose had been stolen for a general's mistress. She remembered lying to patients, promising the medicine was coming, promising they wouldn't feel it. Now the medicine came, every day, without condition. That was what overwhelmed them, not just the quantity, the certainty. For the first time, the phrase endless supply meant something literal, something real. And now she was part of it. In July, Else was asked to train new volunteers, Germans mostly, some former nurses, some just young girls who had survived the bombing and wanted to help. She taught them how to inventory gauze, how to use sterile gloves, how to open a morphine ampule without cracking the vial too high. She trained them to write numbers clearly on patient charts, to measure antibiotics precisely, to discard used gloves without fear of shortage. One girl asked if they'd ever run out. Else paused, then said, "Not if we do it right." The truth was more complicated, but some things were worth believing in. She kept a small notebook now. It was full of numbers, case logs, supply lists, dosages, but also moments. A Polish mother kissed her on the hands after being handed 2 ampoules of penicillin for her infant. A soldier from Stuttgart refused his final pain injection so another man could have it, only to be told there was enough for both. A French boy, burned so badly his eyelids had fused, awoke from surgery and whispered, It doesn't hurt anymore. Else wrote them down. Not because she needed to remember, but because the old Germany had taught her that forgetting was easy. She kept the gauze packet too, the one she hadn't used. Folded clean, white. She would never use it, not because she needed to save it, but because it had already served its purpose. It had shown her what was possible. Months later, long after the station was decommissioned, she boarded a train headed west with a folded uniform and a quiet conviction. That mercy could be organized, that logistics could save lives, that empires could fall and something better could rise from the supplies left behind. She had lived through 1,000 deaths. Now she remembered each life spared by a clean bandage, a full vial, an untouched packet that didn't have to be rationed. There had been enough. That was the miracle. And for those who had never known enough, it was everything.